That spark of innovation, it's just waiting for the perfect combination of tools and talent to bring it to life. Welcome to Pitch, Build, Scale. I'm your host, Chris Fanchi, a recovering startup founder, veteran SaaS marketer, turned dev tech enthusiast and growth specialist. Each episode, we connect with the builders, the visionaries, and the problem solvers who are redefining what's possible with today's technology and pioneering the websites, apps, and software products of tomorrow. These are the conversations that transform how we build, how we sell, and how we scale technology businesses in a world where the tech evolves by the minute. Ready to stay ahead of the curve? This is Pitch, Build, Scale. Hello and welcome to today's episode of Pitch, Build, Scale. I'm your host, Chris Fanchi, founder of Big North Marketing, where we specialize in helping dev shops and SaaS companies scale their revenue. So if you want to learn how to take your SaaS or dev business to the next level, make sure to stick around. And if you're interested in a free growth consultation, just drop us the word growth in the DMs. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Dennis Underwood, CEO of Cyber Crucible, a cybersecurity firm that's turning heads with its autonomous kernel-level defense platform. Dennis is an inventor, an expert in cyber operations, automation, and is leading the charge in hyper-automated data protection, stopping ransomware and identity theft cold. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot. It's good to be here, Chris. Thank you.
So to get started, just tell us a little bit about your journey. What's the personal story or aha moment that led to you founding Cyber Crucible?
Oh, wow. You go back farther, of course, the creation of Cyber Crucible always starts a long time ago before the company even starts, right? But, for me, it was, I was doing a lot of Department of Defense work, intelligence community, things like that. We were actually, inventing things, and I haven't had my kids actually like leave for college yet, but every time we'd make like an invention, make a product, it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of successes and failures, and you get it there and you get your first few customers. The military would kind of take it away and move it off to the other people, and then they give you another invention, and it just felt like it really felt like, having your kids leave for college like over and over and over, like you're like, oh, not again, Um, so I was looking for like a market opportunity. I was looking for some big shift in the market, whether it's the hackers, 'cause I'm in cyber, or whether it's, the defenders, the companies. And I saw that happening with ransomware. And I said, there's a market opportunity here for a new type of product that's preventative. Let's see if we can make this thing happen. And that's really how it all happened. I was informed by the market, and I realized there's a potential opportunity with a new type of product, and chased it.
Okay, so going back a little bit further, because I'm definitely curious, what got you into working in security and how did you end up working for the Department of Defense and some of the three-letter agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is actually my third company or fourth, depending on how you count it. And the previous, I started with an IT services company. That was honestly, I got told no by the person that was going to hire me, and then I switched it around and said, you know what if I come back not as your employee, but as Dennis Underwood LLC? And then they liked that because there was no pension, no health care, none of that, right? No leave. And I was just trying to like land a job, where I was up against a whole bunch of guys, old guys now my age, that had just been laid off from a downturn, and I was just trying to get in there. So that was, that was my background. But I quickly realized that I'm really good at finding what is missing from the manual, not what's in the manual. And so that's essentially what cyber security is, right? Is doing things that the handbook writers didn't envision. And that led me down that journey, and then so I got more into security that way. I was better at figuring out things that are unexpected, which is kind of like an adventurous journey to begin with, right? And what happened was I spent about 6 months researching this supposedly unbreakable botnet. And then I said, you know what, let me see if I can crack this thing, because I already had a business then doing services. And I said, I can really get a higher billing rate from the banks, if I can go ahead and develop some way to take this thing out, And but instead of the banks calling me, it was a couple folks from the government who called, who then were like, "Hey, we like your kind of work," And so that kind of moved forward, and that was how it all, that's how it all happened.
So what was that like? How does working for the government compare to working in the private sector in your experience?
It's in cybersecurity at least, you're basically left with unlimited resources and budget, at least where I was at. So I love when people are like, oh, if only we could hire more cyber people or something. And I'm like, I had unlimited budget. Like there is no lost like for state, where there's just full cyber people that we can just bring on. Oh, there's a solution, right? And I had all the technology, all the AI and cloud computing and everything that I could have ever imagined. And that was I had it all. I had it all at my fingertips, and we still weren't keeping up by any stretch of the imagination, right? And so, um, it was good there, but also, good for testing. But then at the same time, uh, it is government, right? So no matter what you see on TV, government is government, right? And it's always full of inefficiency, people waiting out their retirement in 10 years, like all the things you think about in the DMV, basically, was still happening, right? And so they're all the games being played in government. And so that's the pro and the con, right? The pro is you get access to resources, the con was things can get really slow and then you try to say, hey, hurry up. And they're like, why? I retire in 10 years. And I'm like, oh, well, that kind of stinks to hear. So there you go. There's your answer, in multi-part series.
Yeah. So did I guess that means you got some access maybe to some of the technologies before the public did. Was that something that you had access to, and did you kind of see some of what we've seen come public before it was revealed?
Yeah, I think the best way to put that is because people always think that like, we have the next generation of like Intel chips or something, and maybe they do. I don't know. I wasn't in that world, but like, but what really happens is that, I think for a company, you have to go ahead and you have to justify the expense, have a profit incentive, things like that. And when you're doing R&D and some of like, the special places in the government, you get to try things without a profit incentive. You don't have to have this baked up business plan and investors lined up and, good ROI immediately. So that was really helpful for me to be able to try things that people are just now kind of getting around to. Also, in the cyber world, you kind of have the creme de la creme of hackers to defend against. So, you end up being able to try things that they're trying out that aren't quite old news yet, right? And so you kind of get to be on the bleeding edge on both sides. You get to win and lose, based on your own new inventions. So I do see stuff here that are being funded, and I'm like, well, those are good incremental kind of sheepish innovations, like, but they don't quite know where they have to go quite yet and how far that journey is going to take them.
Mm. Very interesting. So moving back towards your current business, Cyber Crucible. So give us a high level view of what exactly you guys do and how does it differ from traditional endpoint or cloud security solution?
Yeah, so I mean, for the past what, 10, 15 years, I don't know if I'm showing my age at that, but EDRs, have been around, endpoint discover and response, right? And then they made an extended discover and response. And I joke they'll keep adding X's on until it becomes like an awkward situation, right? The um the concept was that, hey, we can't keep up with the hackers throwing their malware, so let's just monitor all of our clients. And eventually a pattern might emerge. If you use like gazelle and lions, like, okay, well, if the lions always come from this direction, then we know to kind of stay away from that direction, and maybe don't go by that section of the creek kind of thing, right? Sorry for the gazelles that got lost along the way, but that's what we had to learn as a herd, right? And that's EDR, right? But if the lions are constantly changing their tactics, then no pattern emerges among the dead gazelles, like to be like, oh, there is no place we can go to hide anymore. And that's kind of where things have gone, where, there is some AI, a lot of automation that's helped them to auto mutate, to auto create new malware. Not as much chat GPT, despite that being in the news a lot. It's a lot more kind of nerdier versions of AI and machine learning and stuff. What happened was that we said, well, the hackers have automated their mutations enough that there is no safe place for the herd to go, and everyone's constantly just getting picked off. And so I said, if we can figure that out, it has to be a hyper automated solution because the hackers are using that. Then there's a market for that, and ransomware is a market in which, for the hackers, the customer can't ignore it. The customer being like, the victim, like, and so
Yeah.
and the shareholders and the employees and everyone, it's hard for them to ignore that. So I realized that, this is something that is going to be market visible on the defender side. On the companies, the CFO will understand the cost. It's not like a data breach where they're like, well, how much did it impact, our revenue? Like, well, it didn't really, this is much different, right? And so we said, let's go ahead and move to a preventative solution if we can. What needs to happen to make that happen? And of course, that, like everything else, that started with one invention and then became more and then more as we stacked it up. But now we have a deploying product and several patents, several more on the way. We decided to withhold some things from our patents, but it's been a good journey. And as we sit here now, we have good revenue clients that tend to really enjoy the protection we afford. And a lot of folks, it feels a bit like the 90s where you could install your Symantec or your McAfee and then you're kind of done for the day, right? There's not 900 knobs to turn.
So you mentioned patents. How do you balance giving away what you're working on with something like with that what you're doing? Putting out a patent, you're wanting to protect your IP, of course, but at the same time, you're kind of giving away what you're doing and how you're defending things, not only to competitors, but to the people on the other side who are trying to break things, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think the world, at least in cybersecurity, it's too easy for the hackers who are already reverse engineering and seeing how things tick, right? I think it's a bit of a fallacy to say, oh, I'm going to produce a cybersecurity tool of which the hackers won't know what I'm doing. Even when we were beginning, our very first deployments actually of our software, the hackers, I was getting calls from burner phones, if you know what those are, from different parts of the world, and they wanted to talk about our software. And in the first 30 minutes, well, I should say the first 5 minutes, each one of them had their own version of saying, let's cut to the chase. I already have your software up in front of me. I'm going to name a couple things so I'm already looking at everything. I'm trying to figure out how to get past you. So I think that's not as much of a concern as people, maybe think it is. If you're building a robust product that's not fragile. We also saw where we had some competitors who were definitely behaving, we'll say, unscrupulously. And then their websites looked very similar to ours and, things like that. And so they couldn't quite figure out the tech, but they were trying. And so I said, well, there's power in transparency then. If all you're doing is hurting yourself by hiding, then you have to embrace the publicity of it and just be like, then we're going to build in the open. And that's what we ended up doing. I had a knowledge base that was extensive, but it was all the people doing like proof of concepts were they kept losing the password for the knowledge base. But when I kept seeing weird logins from these one or two competitors. I call them marketing admirers. And every time a change would go into the knowledge base, it would show up in their documentation. So I basically,
Wow.
once again, I said, I'm only hurting ourselves in the company as we scale, as we deploy. We really need to build in the open and just leave it all out there because we're hurting the prospects because they keep losing their passwords somehow. Some of them were the same passwords that the bad guys now had, I should say the competitors had, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I was like, well, we got to build in the open then. That's the only option left.
yeah. And it's an interesting debate going on right now about IP and open source versus closed source. Where do you typically stand on that, especially as these new technologies are coming out?
Yeah, open source is cool in that you can take an idea, but in my experience, and of course I can only speak from my market. If your next visitor is like they're building dialysis software, then I'm like, well, that's not me. But I look at the open source and I realize that these aren't people's day jobs normally. And so you have a whole bunch of commercial companies, closed source, that are watching the open source and trying to look for lessons learned or grab things. But the person who's doing it for free or the team doing it for free, they're usually very skilled, I've learned, but they only have so much time in the day, right? And then work catches up to them, and then you end up having to like copy the code over and then keep it going, for your own special needs.
Yeah.
And it's a good start, but it usually ends up, for me at least, always ended up at the end with like this parallel project that looks nothing like the other project, and now I'm like, now what do I do? Like I can't. They did something cool, and now I got to redo everything. Um, the closed source, the thing about cybersecurity is that it's very much a faith-based service that we're providing. In other words, there's not really a good attestation. And if there was, then we'd be using it, right? And every test that every vendor comes back with says how awesome they are, but then like the very next day they're hacked, and so it's like,
Right.
well, like that test must not have worked well. So for me, it's like, closed source is definitely a profit incentive, but there needs to be better, some kind of quality control, quality assurance, attestation of functionality. I think that's, SBOM, which is a topic about supply chain and what libraries are you really using? Are they vulnerable themselves? I think that's really a good start for us as a community, even if, we're not going to be able to have everyone kind of release their code to the open for everyone to see.
Gotcha. So you've talked a little bit about kernel level protection and hyperautomation. That's something that shows up on your company's website. So can you unpack that a little bit for non-technical people who might be listening?
Yeah, yeah. So there's essentially two sections inside the operating system. And one is what they call the user space or user land. Engineers are not always the most creative, right? They try to name things plainly for you. So as you can guess, users and applications live in application space or user space, very, very similar. And then below all of that is a little bit of a barrier, and that's called the kernel. And that's where all the really important stuff to keep things running goes and in your desktop or laptop. It's also where things that are really important, like maybe like your printer or your monitor, are able to speak to the operating system and trade information back and forth and settings and things like that. So in Windows, whenever you make a driver, it's called, whether it's like a sound card or a video card or even a camera, you're using the kernel space to communicate all the bits and bytes and all of the really important stuff to make it so that the user experience is nice. It's kind of like, the bottom of the well, so to speak. And so we realized that, we had to get down there very deep into the operating system to get the kind of data we needed. And so we did that. We have a whole bunch of AI and everything else that we use. But then what happened was that as we were doing things, every now and then we'd have to go up, and Windows said, yeah, here's a math program you can use to help you compute the math you need for your program. And we're like, awesome, I love math. I love not doing math even better. Let's give it to them. And then, but then what happened was that our data from the kernel, the bottom of the well, had to come up out of the well, ask Windows for the answer, and then go back down, right? And that, believe it or not, takes time. So to be hyper automated, you need to cut that time away. We also found the hackers realized that, like, maybe not Dennis at Cyber Crucible, but maybe a whole bunch of products were like, hey, they all love this one math program, and it's actually next to the applications, next to our malware. Let's go ahead and like break it, so that they keep on asking math questions, but they don't quite get an answer. And so we realized that we had to do more to fuel our hyper automation. We had to do more in our driver. So we ended up actually ourselves having to figure out how the math formulas work in this Microsoft provided application, which is really, really good quality. It's just slower and kind of vulnerable, and figure out how to make it all happen in the driver. And so, the military analogies are always the best ones, I think, for that. Like a nuclear missile submarine that's like able to like do its mission no matter what happens in the US, or there's some kind of other survivable kind of like silo that like, no matter what happens, the earthquakes, hurricanes, whatever, we're good, right? And that's basically what we had to build, was this super resilient, super automated, hardened application that lived in a very special part of the operating system.
Wow, fascinating. And
So
so you say
I'm at-
you you say you've achieved 100% success rate in preventing ransomware. Is that
yeah,
right?
yeah, so far, knock on wood, across all our deployments, no one has bypassed us. They've tried like, using, they'll actually insert their code into trusted applications. It's called process injection. It's just as spooky as it sounds, right? And they'll insert code. I always like awkward pop culture references, so I'll tell people, it's like a Sigourney Weaver and Aliens, and it's not just a human anymore. There's a parasite in there, right? And they've tried, bypassing, allowed applications lists and all kind of stuff to get past that. We've caught them every time, and that's good. Knock on wood. Eventually, one day, I'm sure we're going to. Hopefully not tomorrow, right? But I'm sure that we will have some kind of like case study saying, "Hey, they found a way in. Turns out we're not perfect, and we already fixed it. but it's been a couple years now, so that's a pretty good run without Hemming. And we've had a lot of customers across, North America and the Middle East. And so we have certainly been put to the test, but there's going to be a bad day one day, right? And that's fine. Hasn't happened yet, so I'm going to keep on bragging as long as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. From a marketing standpoint, you almost feel like maybe 99.9% would be more believable, right?
I agree with you. Yeah, I always wonder about that. You know what? I tried with every now and then I hit by someone and they're like, "Oh, we think it should be this number," and I'm like, "Okay, sure. Well, whatever you think you believe, it's going to be a higher number." So when I had one conversation where it was like they said, "Oh, you know what? 96% is more realistic," and I said, "Okay, well, sure. If that's what floats your boat, are you going to buy? Because that's really the only thing I care about here, like." And then they said, "Well, I invested in this company. They haven't had deployments yet, but they're 98% effective." And I was like, "Okay, so do you just tell me 96 so you could like then tell me 98?" Like I was like, dude, like come on, like so I figure as long as I'm 100, yeah, but I agree with you. Like 99.99 is almost more believable, right? Especially if you can link it to a use case and say, "Congrats, hacker free." Like you did it. You got past us.
Right, right. So looking at the overall landscape then, how are you seeing enterprise security strategies evolve right now? What are companies still getting wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think as engineers, we're taught about groupthink as the way things are done. Like we're all building off the shoulders of giants every generation, right? Every year. And sometimes that's a really helpful thing, and sometimes a really hurtful thing. Like if we invented some kind of new rocket, I'm sure there's gonna be a whole bunch of like literal like space rocket engineers that are gonna be like, I like the old way we were doing it. I don't know about this new thing. Like powered by lasers. Come on. Like so. And that happens in history over and over with people, right? In security, I see sometimes there's a couple analogies I'll use. But there's a story I was told by a really old advisor at one point about there's like this joke that the guy that has a machine gun and he's like going up to the general who's fighting, and the general is like him and his men are like making arrows like crazy as fast as they can for the archers. And then this guy's trying to sell him a machine gun, and he's like, "I'm way too busy to talk to a salesperson right now. I'm busy whittling arrows." Like, and the guy's like, "I could end this whole battle for you," like, and sometimes there's something like that going on in cybersecurity, where they're just so busy, which then leads to the second thing, which is that, now that it's been a decade and more of chasing all these alerts and scrolling and trying to figure out, which part of the herd is the lion going to attack next and trying to keep up constantly, right? And the lions at this point have helicopters, so it's just a whole different, game. But like, and then I've noticed that that group thing comes into play. And if you come in with something completely different, ironically, in the 90s, it would have probably been accepted more quickly and readily because people were like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's like my Norton only better," like. And nowadays, everyone's kind of trapped. And I always think of it like in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. There's a scene where the dad's trying to keep his daughter happy. I think her name is Veruca Salt, I think. And the employees are all ripping open boxes, right? And I feel like a lot of the AI companies coming out right now are like, okay, what if they're constraining their thinking to say, what if we put like robotic skeletons on them? They can rip open more boxes. And then, they're doing more. Well, like what if we give them like more caffeine? We can inject it into them and give them faster boxes. And then they're kind of trapped, right, in that world, that factory scene, constraining their vision. And then here I'm like, why are we even opening up boxes? Like, let's set up like a X-ray machine with a conveyor belt and that'll fix it, right? So it's almost like the group think is sometimes really helpful and sometimes really hurting, just like the ads when cars came out and all those ads were like, good horse, scary machine, and people didn't want to change that either. It's just human nature.
Yeah. Yeah. So with the technology changing as much as it is right now, AI native tools becoming mainstream, what's the most exciting or concerning trend that you're seeing in cybersecurity right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple things that I see. The first is that the AI is really being used, like because when you say AI, you're really meaning like Chat GPT nowadays. It's almost like let me Google that, and so it's impersonating people better and better. Like, hey, I want to impersonate the CFO at a regional bank, and then email. So all the tools are there, The thing that's scariest for me actually isn't that they are getting better at running these automated campaigns. It's that they're not doing it as fast as they could. Because that tells me one thing I've learned in the last 5 years watching them evolve on around ransomware is that success is their biggest enemy to evolution. Just like, I guess on the growth side, if the company is just like having awful sales techniques, but they're just like landing a sale every day, like then they don't need to have this like really fancy sales stack. And I'm seeing the same thing with the hackers, where I'm seeing where their success is so great, their success rate is good enough that they're not improving their operations on the AI side as much as nearly as they could, right? That to me is the most concerning thing. It's that they're getting in with such regularity that it's actually they're kind of comfortable. Like they're getting in and they're doing things. They're not doing what could be done with some of these like AI SDRs, where they're pulling in data about your family from Facebook and Twitter feed and everything else and doing this hyper targeted thing. It happens, but it seems like a lot of it is just not that complicated. They're just getting better at their English with AI and able to conduct a whole bunch of campaigns at once without some person sitting there with a poor accent, against their target market, manually calling.
Yeah. So, from a sales standpoint, in my experience, things like cybersecurity are typically much easier to sell in a reactive situation than proactive.
Yeah.
Are you seeing that still be the case today? Or are companies, because of the way technology is evolving, starting to feel like we need to be a little more proactive about defending against things?
Yes, a really great question. So we are seeing that they are saying proactive. It's interesting. I'm seeing it from the business side as much, if not more, than the cyber side. That's not necessarily saying that the cyber guys are doing anything wrong or that they're stuck in groupthink or anything. It's just that the VP of sales or the CFO will take a phone call. They're not inundated, especially if your communication is all about the thing that they just saw put the company in the red. Um, and the cyber guys are just so heads down trying to keep up, right? They're busy whittling arrows trying to, keep up. And here's the salesperson with the machine gun. You're right about reactive, that there's budgets are normally a little bit freer. I'll say that the costs involved in ransomware attacks nowadays are significant enough and painful enough on the technical side that the only time I have a hard time getting in is actually the hardest time, I should say, is right after they had an attack, because they're not in a state to, they're getting phone calls from like every incident response firm, every forensic company, every security company. They all promise the world, right? Pay us first, we'll worry about that later. And we're right or wrong, we're one more person calling them, and they're emotionally are not in a state to make rational or thoughtful decisions, right? And that can be harmful, for the sale. But again, it's just like, the insurance guys aren't hitting up people in the ER after, after a car accident to try to sell them a better insurance plan. That comes later, right? They're not doing that right there, though. It's the lawyers that are chasing the ambulances, right? Not the State Farm
Yeah.
reps.
Yeah, exactly. So, what are some of the ways that your clients have changed their approach to cybersecurity once they implemented your solution?
That's a very good question. So, and I keep going back to the 90s because I think that was when EDR started to be adopted, right? After that didn't work anymore, right? And, back at that time, people weren't up all night turning knobs. It was installed, right or wrong, it worked, and they moved on to all the other things you have to get to, right? I've noticed that does a couple things for us. When I talk about Cyber Crucible, the conversation definitely goes to one where we're more talking about giving them back control over their business, over their careers, over their network, right? Uh, if it's a partner, I kind of, I tell them, look, I'm not taking money away from you. That monitoring contract previously was a pass through to the hosted EDR company. And I say, I know you don't have the resources. No one really has the resources, including the EDR company, but I'm giving you access now to that revenue stream you used to have on keeping that Symantec or McAfee or whatever, FireEye tool going. And people like that, both on the partner side and on the customer side, because they get to control the SLAs, the service level agreements, they get to control their future. And, even if their employees have a bad day and they miss a hack, I mean, we'll catch it, but even if they miss a hack, it's not like they're the ones losing their job but having no control over it, right? They signed the contract, it's their employee. they have a quote unquote throat to choke. I don't know whoever made that analogy mainstream in engineering, but like that was their person to point at, right? And say that's the person who this was their KPI for their job. And they like that control a lot, more than the tech even, right? It's like they like being able to actually hold it in their hands.
So how then is that one of the key differentiators when you're going to market, when you're talking to potential clients, is that control? Is that part of your messaging that's let you stand out and kind of win enterprise trust right now?
A little bit later, yeah. I think it's almost one of those situations where there's an emotional roller coaster that happens for everyone who deploys our product. The first is that, for every product, especially one that, maybe Gartner hasn't said is the best one and they paid the Gartner bill or whatever. And so what I see is that, first they're like, okay, every security tool breaks everything. Everyone kind of gird your loins, here we go. And then it doesn't, and it gets quiet. And then they kind of so their anxiety is like way high. They're like, oh, look at that. It didn't quite go as like I thought it would. It actually works. And I didn't have to uninstall anything. It works with my existing security. But then it goes back up after a little bit because they're like, wait a second, is it actually doing anything? It turned on. Is this just like vaporware? And so the anxiety goes back up, and we have to kind of show now that it actually, is working. And then it goes back down, it evens out. I always joke that they treat us a little bit like their fire suppression system.
Yeah.
Now we joke that if you're up at night thinking about your fire suppression system, then maybe you should talk to someone about that. And that's kind of how they treat a product after a while. Things get quieter, they start to trust it more. Then they start talking about the control. They start believing it, right? They're like, look, I can really get a handle on this. And anyone who thinks that they're going to fire a security person is not. They don't have a good view on how many tasks and tickets just don't get done every day. And this gives them the time to get to all the things that they know that should be done to harden themselves, to better manage risk. They just don't have the time or the resources. Now they do.
So, in terms of data security and data privacy, are there concerns from enterprises that your software will have access to some of their data, or are they more concerned about protecting it from outsiders?
Great question. So we are seeing some movement on the international scene where they're looking to have their data a little bit closer to home. In terms of we'll say the privacy folks, at the business, they confirm that we're not taking any of their user data. We actually used to capture encryption keys, which we use to decrypt, right? And then that didn't work anymore. The hackers learned that just having the key doesn't work anymore after a while. So we actually kind of stopped that because there was a lot of nervousness because they realized that you know, we have all the encryption keys for the whole enterprise, right? And all the settings and everything for every user, every application, right? But we had the ransomware ones too, right? And so there was kind of like this grumbling, but they accepted it, right? But then after it didn't work for ransomware anymore, all we had were just collection on people's activities and encryptions and everything, right? And so at that point, I asked a lawyer just to make sure, and they were kind of like, "Yeah, that's you shouldn't be doing that, like that's bad." I said, "Yeah, exactly. That's what we thought, but I want to make sure there wasn't some some weird gotcha." So we actually turned it into a cryptanalytic engine, that doesn't worry about the encryption keys. Um, but that was the biggest thing. Now we don't collect user data. We protect, for instance, session tokens and passwords and keys, but we don't actually collect them. We don't make them available. There's a whole bunch of different tricks we do to, not have that privacy data from people.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So what is your go-to-market motion at this point for as a company? Let's talk just business side entirely. Are you mainly outbound, inbound partnerships? How are you getting in front of clients?
Mainly outbound. I don't think that's going to change for a while based on just, the enterprise sales, mid-cap business people. They're busy, they're not out there. They're searching, I can tell you that, but they're not calling you up saying, I want to spend $600,000 on, on a piece of software. I feel bored today, and that's just not happening, right? And it's normally committees that will purchase. Like it may be the IT director, but, he's also talking to the CFO or the COO or something like that, right? So, we see it outbound. We have a lot of partnerships. We have more coming. And we try to pick partners we think will sell our product, and sell it effectively. So we have some great partners. Of course, everyone has partners across the spectrum. Ones who, aren't really selling stuff anymore, but they're happy to sign something, all the way to like they have an aggressive sales growth plan and they're looking to execute and they need a differentiator. And so we have all of that. The biggest differentiator that I see is that we're selling straws. I tell every salesperson or partner, it's not a complex sale, right? So what happens actually is that, we have a simplified sales pitch, a frictionless product. It all kind of aligns around lack of friction, like smoothness, um, like a hockey rink, right? And so that's been very useful for us in terms of selling rapidly because it's an endpoint agent, right? Like there's only so much the market will handle, so much a person will pay on an endpoint, right? And so
Mm.
we price aggressively, we get it out there, and then we move on to the next client, and we try everything we can to remove friction and remove complexity. Even our knowledge base is phenomenal in terms of the detail, because if we get asked a question a couple times, we're like, put that in a knowledge base, because we need to keep our bench very lean or non-existent and keep focused on more innovation and more deployments.
Great. So last question then. What is the biggest challenge that you're currently facing in terms of getting in front of the right customers?
It's just the noise in the market, quite honestly. And there's no like standards in advertising and cybersecurity. Like my thought is always like, if cyber marketers were and salespeople marketers were like, MRI or X-ray people, then like products, then there'd probably be some sick people out there just from the X-rays just going nuts, right? There's just no efficacy standard, right? And so I'll see where my marketing will actually get replicated, and my companies and my partners will just get replicated. And there's no karma police out there to call and say, hey, this person's not telling the truth. We even had one group where they admitted they admitted to us, like, oh yeah, our product's not actually doing what we say it's doing. And that was like their defense for some like contract issue. And I was just like, well, whether you're scamming your customers is not my problem. That's not in the contract, like, but that's just cyber, right? I mean, that's just the way it works.
Wow, that's crazy. Crazy to
Yeah, we have a
hear.
lot of demos on our website because it's kind of like we're a big believer in do what you say you're going to do, and if there's a way to prove it, then prove it, right? So we have a whole bunch of bake-off demos on our website, and more coming. We always have more on the way. It's just finding time to do them. From stuff we've captured and recorded, and we put it up there to show. Here is where the money meets the product right here. This is the value.
Makes sense. Well, Dennis, this has been a great, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing. Cybersecurity is clearly in a transformative era, and you're leading some of that evolution. It's really exciting. So, for those listening who want to learn more about you or connect with you or your team at Cyber Crucible, where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really active on LinkedIn. Just go ahead and find. Now, I do have like 15,000 connections or something, some big number like that from organic outreach and education. Just hit me up. If you see that I'm connected to like, your high school bully and your best friend, like it's just because I have 15,000 connections, and cyber's kind of a small market, right? So I do get asked, oh, you know this person, and I'm like, let me see how much I know 'em, like, and so, but LinkedIn's a great place for security people to connect, engage how they want to connect, and then disconnect, right? So basically, what's going to happen is they'll connect, love to have engaging conversations, don't know most of my connections like intimately, but the people that I do talk to, we talk about, at least once a week about, cool stuff where I get asked questions about things.
Very cool. Thanks again for joining us. And for all of you out there listening, please subscribe, leave us a review. And as always, keep building, keep pitching, and keep scaling. Thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pitch, Build, Scale. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast provider so you never miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.